Microphone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 23rd week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcome, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Karen Aram and David Green. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Pano. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we've referred to, and further comments from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Today is June 5th. Tomorrow is the anniversary of DDay, 6th of June, 1944, the landings of the U.S. and U.K. armies in France in World War II. It's an important day in American mythology and propaganda because it's the linchpin for how it came about that America won the war, defeated Nazism, and defended the Jews. All of that, of course, is nonsense. That's not what happened. The war was won on the Eastern Front by Russia, where casualties in comparison to the U.S. and U.K. were on the order of 50-1. And even after the invasion of France on D-Day in 1944, to the very end of the war, the following summer, the vast majority of German troops were concentrated on the Eastern Front because that's where the war was being decided. D-Day was a sideshow. And it was a sideshow that the U.S. and the U.K. put off for a long time as they tried to make sure that Germany and Russia would exhaust each other in the outcome of the war, and the U.S. would be around to pick up the pieces. That was a plan that was the decision by American planners going back to the very beginning of the war, indeed before the beginning of the war, what was called in America Grand Area Planning. Grand Area being the area of the majority of the world that the U.S. would control economically at the end of the war, as was obvious to everyone. Once Japan and Germany were put in their places, the U.S., as the dominant country, would have a preeminent role, economic role, in the world at large. That's exactly what happened. And the American planners at the end of the war saw an occasion to put their plans into effect, and America, as the only undamaged country, winner or loser, to emerge from the war, was able to exercise control over the rest of the world. The U.S., with 5% of the world's population in 1945, had 50% of the world's wealth. And it's maintaining that disparity, as the leading liberal commentator in the State Department, George Kennan, said, maintaining that disparity that was the goal of American policy and remains so to today. And if you want to look at the source of modern American policy, particularly vis-a-vis Russia, but also in regard to Germany and Japan, examine the planning of American government officials during and after the Second World War. The mythology of the war is perhaps more important for Americans today than anything else, because on the basis of this generalized and false knowledge of the Second World War, Americans as a whole assume that the U.S. goes to war only in the defense of freedom and to combat real and present evils. The history of the Second World War has been the crucial propaganda story in modern American politics. And there's a very good book that is an antidote to those lies. Nicholson Baker, in 2008, published a book called Human Smoke, The Beginnings of World War II, The End of Civilization. That was his title. It was a history of World War II that questions the commonly held belief that the Allies, the U.S. and the U.K., wanted to avoid the war at all costs, but were forced into action by Hitler's unforgiving crusade. It consists largely of official government transcripts, the book does, and other documents from the time. Baker cites documents that suggest the leaders of the U.S. and the U.K. were provoking Germany into war, showing, for example, that Britain bombed Germany before Germany bombed Britain in 1939, and that the leaders of those two nations had ulterior motives for wanting to participate. His portraits of Churchill's imperial arrogance, Franklin Roosevelt's anti-Semitism, the machinations of the arms merchants, the military-industrial complex of the time, the Germans' death wish, the peculiar politics of Germany between the wars, and the efforts of pacifists are unforgettable, said Chalmers Johnson, one of the major authors on related topics since the Second World War. People are going to get really angry at Baker, wrote Mark Kolansky, for criticizing their favorite war. But he hasn't fashioned his tale from gossip. It's documented with copious notes and attributions. The book is in fact a collection of snippets from contemporary news. The grace of these well-ordered snapshots is that there is no diatribe. You are left to put things together yourself. Human Smoke may be one of the most important books you will ever read. Close quote. That's Mark Kolansky reviewing it in the LA Times, and I think that's exactly right. I'm going to take another minute here and talk about Baker's conclusion. And in the afterword of the book, he writes, "This book ends on December 31st, 1941. Most of the people who died in the Second World War were at that moment still alive. Was it a good war? Did waging it help anyone who needed help? Those were the basic questions that I hoped to answer when I began writing. I've relied on newspaper articles, diaries, memos, memoirs, and public proclamations, each tied as much as possible to a particular date because they helped me understand the grain of events better than the secondary sources did. But I've used many secondary sources as well. All the texts are published and publicly available one way or another, and all are in English. The book itself is a collection of news reports from the time, a paragraph followed by another from a contemporary news report. The New York Times is probably the single richest resource for the history and prehistory of the war years, more so than British newspapers, which operated under heavy censorship, radio speeches, official press statements, the texts of airdropped leaflets, translated foreign news, and snippets of unedited congressional testimony are all to be found in the New York Times, as well as good reporting. The New York Herald Tribune is another fount of specificity. Indeed, my interest in World War II began when, some years ago, I first opened bound volumes of the Herald Tribune and read headlines for the bombing of Berlin and Tokyo and wondered how we got there. Martin Gilbert's many books, especially his fascinating, impeccable Churchill War Papers, were also useful in preparing this work. The title of the book, Human Smoke, comes from Franz Heider, one of Hitler's restive but compliant generals. General Heider told an interrogator that when he was imprisoned in Auschwitz late in the war, he saw flakes of smoke blow into his cell. Human smoke, he called it. I dedicate this book to the memory of Clarence Pickett and other American and British pacifists. They've never really gotten their due. They tried to save Jewish refugees, feed Europe, reconcile the United States and Japan, and stop the war from happening. They failed, but they were right. Close quote, Nicholson Baker from his book, Human Smoke. You're watching News from Neptune, a Don't Talk About the War edition. And we'll start with David Green.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on that with some comments about Israel-Palestine. I know I talk about that a lot. but I've been particularly agitated this week, so I'm using news from Neptune to get a few things off my chest and to, I think, appropriately follow up on some of the comments that Carl has made. I think the sticking point we always run into when we try to challenge the current conventional wisdom is to provide some historical context. And that's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, in the context of the mainstream media. So in order to explain anything, we seem to have insurmountable obstacles towards providing any background in any context. This is the problem that Noam Chomsky refers to often in terms of what he calls concision, and in terms of what he refers to, and Howard Zinn refers to, and the idea that if we don't understand history, it's as if we were born yesterday. In the ironic spirit of that, let me try in 250 words that I sat down and wrote yesterday, which is part of a letter, which is a letter to the editor, has been submitted as a letter to the editor within their word guidelines, and see if I can explain the Middle East in 250 words, lacking, of course, all of the details that would be necessary to challenge what the conventional wisdom is. I'll quote my own letter here. From 1947 to 49, the establishment of Israel was accompanied by ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians. In 1967, Israel secured its role in U.S. strategic control of the Middle East by smashing Egypt in a war of Israel's choice, with U.S. support and transfer of weapons ever since. As a quid pro quo for hegemonic services, Israel has maintained its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, Palestine, and illegally transfers Israeli citizens to those regions. That would include now the West Bank, although at one time that was Gaza also. The results have been apartheid on the West Bank and the ongoing genocidal siege of Gaza, with regular massacres to prevent a Palestinian state as part of a two-state solution. Israel and the U.S. have been the only rejectionists of this two-state solution in the UN for decades. The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, BDS, mistakenly, I think, commits to neither one state nor two states. Nevertheless, its nonviolent opposition to apartheid has been effective, especially on college campuses, and has supporters of Israeli apartheid panicked. These supporters, the Israel lobby broadly understood, have enormous resources with which to challenge BDS and use McCarthyite tactics unashamedly. Their influence on campus administrators created the context for the Saleta affair on this campus. Their influence on Illinois state legislators has resulted in unanimous support for or unwillingness to oppose apartheid. Both of our legislators, that is, legislators that represent state legislators that represent Urbana-Champaign, should be unequivocally condemned for their recent not voting, quote-unquote, decision on this issue. Finally, affiliates of local Jewish institutions are enlisted in de facto support of apartheid and are aligned with extreme right-wing News Gazette editors in this effort. And let me just follow that up by saying that one of the things that provoked me to write this, and to write it in a sort of a more plain version than I was feeling, has to do with these ongoing sort of McCarthyite assaults, these slanderous smear tactics that are being used against supporters of the BDS movement Students for Justice in Palestine and so forth. It's kind of ramped up in my own consciousness in the last week when it was revealed. Actually, Amy Goodman had a blurb about this on her headlines about a group called Canary Mission, which doesn't identify themselves but is basically conducting a campaign, so far just an online campaign, to identify supporters of the BDS movement and to encourage employers not to hire them. Mm-hmm. It may sound ineffectual and pathetic on their part for this shadowy group to do this, but it's consistent with the kind of tactics that we've seen, generally speaking, in opposition to this movement on campus. Here we have a professor named Carrie Nelson who has, for the last couple years, devoted himself towards basically demonizing BDS supporters. And so I think it's possible that these efforts are having or will have real consequences. I don't think that this Canary Mission website will be particularly successful, but it does again demonstrate how they perceive the growing influence of this movement and what they're willing to do to oppose it. The tactics are quite lurid. If you watch the video on the website, it's quite lurid. And the only little bit of insight I have into it is that at the end of last year, there was a video that went viral on YouTube called The Jewish Voices. And it was produced, it's clearly produced. I wrote an article on Mondoweiss about this. You can look it up just under the Jewish Voices on Mondoweiss. And you can see that it's the same narrator, the same style, the same sort of video style, the same sort of imagery that they're using to slander, to create this very lurid propagandistic context to slander the supporters of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movements as being anti-Semites. So I would just conclude these comments by saying I've summarized in this brief thing that I've read, I've summarized some historical points where if you read the mainstream media, you would say, what is he talking about? The establishment of Israel, the War of 1967. But these are all pretty settled issues in historical scholarship. For instance, it's clear that the 67 war was Israel's war of choice, just as Carl was saying, to a certain extent, that World War II was Britain's war of choice, or Winston Churchill's war of choice. There's a lot of complicated things to understand in making that argument, but in terms of the 67 war, it's clear that Israel did not have to fight this war to protect itself or save itself, and that its war was part of a larger strategy, which we've seen unfolding ever since. So again, we can't discuss these things in the mainstream media. Therefore, we can't have an intelligent conversation about the clear nature of Israeli imperial ambitions in Palestine, about the occupation, about apartheid. But these things should be simply as plain as our understanding of the colonial settlers that came to this hemisphere and dealt with the natives that used to live on the ground on which we live.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media, and that often means the things that the media don't mention, or what is perhaps even more difficult, a serious understanding of the things that they do mention. Karen, your comments on David's observations here?
No, I'm quite pleased that David has chosen to bring up this topic, because I think that we are living in an era now whereby we're on the cusp of McCarthyism, or are we actually living under McCarthyism? I think it depends on how much we see and how much we hear. But this website, I did find it rather despicable. Their villainization of professors who speak out against Israeli apartheid, and threatening students with lack of employment for being activists. It begs the question, who's next? I mean, and this is something we always have to look at. who is next on the list to be vilified, or who's next on the list to be droned, or who's next on the list to be impoverished. So I'm pleased David has always been speaking out against this, and I encourage others to do the same.
Yeah, I would just follow up, just if I make a follow-up comment on this Canary Mission. I mean, it's almost comical in the sense that you go, there's several tabs and several pages, and they've got lists of organizations like Mondo Weiss and Students for Justice in Palestine and so forth. And then they've got a page of individuals, including our own Francis Boyle.
Right.
But what you see on that page of individuals is a very attractive group of young people who are politically passionate.
Right.
And, you know, not that they all have to look good, but a lot of them do look, they look good and young, and exactly the kind of people that you want to encourage with intellectual curiosity and political principles and activism on campus. And I would assume that's the kind of atmosphere that, well, how do I put this? I mean, Phyllis Wise, our chancellor here, has been calling for civility in terms of campus life, and the question becomes whether civility includes attacks and demonization of such people, or whether it really includes providing an environment for them to express themselves and for their opponents to express themselves regarding the issues themselves, rather than these personal attacks. But it's clear that, you know, Wise is more concerned about silencing the words of someone like Stephen Saleta, or just, you know, persecuting him for saying angry things on tweets, rather than protecting the rights of those students who are actually saying, making actions, performing actions, and engaging in activism on campus in a way that in a way which attacks on them really goes against, if there's any non-hypocrisy at all, or non-self-servingness in all of what Wise is doing. She should be alarmed that anybody is attacking students on campus in quite this way. But of course, it's to expect too much to ask any genuine self-criticism or consistency in these views.
It's important to see, though, that the destruction of Stephen Saleta's academic freedom, the clear violation of it, the obvious violation of it, really has less to do with Stephen Saleta than it does with other academics who might be tempted to express those same opinions in the university. Those opinions are not to be expressed in the university. Serious criticism of Israel's murderous assault on Gaza is not to be part of the discussion on American campuses. It's about as clear as can be that this is the real motive of the operation. And I recommend the lead article on today's Counterpunch website, where an academic in North Carolina spends some time talking about what's going on in universities right now, about the neoliberal pull of contemporary universities, and the way in which examples like the Saleta case, the violation of academic freedom at the University of Illinois, is typical. This is what's going on in the academy, and why the American Academy at the time of the Southwest Asian War, which is what later generations, if there are any, might call what we've been doing for the last 15 years, why the university's behavior in the Southwest Asian War is so different from the American universities' behavior during the Southeast Asian War of the 1960s and 70s. I recommend the article very highly. I have a question for you, David, on this important first, a preliminary question. Is it necessary to explain, do you think, or is this just my age showing? Is it necessary to explain what McCarthyism is?
Yeah, you know,
I have a terrible feeling. I was
thinking that while I've used this
necessary
word, because the word has been used so consistently.
Yeah.
I mean, one might argue that's become part of the lexicon. But then again, actually, I was thinking something similar. Sort of, you know, maybe I should explain this word, or maybe maybe we should not be using this word so casually and assuming that people understand what it is and basically what it amounts to, and also because it's there's a certain dishonesty or simplicity in labeling this period from post-World War II to say 1954 as the McCarthy era. It was really the Truman era, and
Very good point.
all of the repression that went on, the anti-communist hysteria certainly wasn't attributed to one alcoholic senator from Wisconsin, and
Exactly.
but beyond that, I mean, just it serves the word serves to define. I was actually reading something. I was looking at some show I was watching had an old video of how you spot a communist from that era. How you spot a communist. How you notice. How you figure out what their motives are. What they're really up to. How you recognize these people that are trying to destroy our country. And it occurred to me that although it may be thought if you explained. You might replace the word communist to update it with terrorist or with is something to do with Islam. I think the best word that explains what we're going through now would be to use the word anti-Semite. This is what all this rhetoric that has to do with these students supporting Palestine has to do with defining them as anti-Semites, and how you really discern by what they say and how they do and what they talk about and what they don't talk about that these people are really anti-Semites. So I would say that ironically, considering that much of what embodied McCarthyism was implied that not only were communists behind the stuff, but there were also a lot of Jews behind this communist movement. Now what you have is pro-Israel people sort of hiding, and pro-U.S. foreign policy people hiding behind the notion that people that are critical of Israel, as well as U.S. foreign policy in a larger context, are really motivated by Jew hatred. So to answer your, to get back to your question, McCarthyism. I mean, we should explain what it is, and we should explore that and unpack that a little bit. But it's charges. I think one way of dealing with it is to talk about charges that can't really be answered. I mean, these kind of charges that can't be refuted, that impute motives and devious means, that there just isn't any way to argue against it. There's this, again, I've used the word lurid several times already today, so I should find another one. But it's these lurid aspersions cast upon people that have nothing to do with debating the reality of what's going on in the world and what they're doing. And this, obviously, the word Manichaean comes into mind, looking at the world in terms of the forces of good versus the forces of evil. I mean, good versus evil has its place, but not in the way that it's usually expressed.
I think the first thing to say about McCarthyism is it's a massive exercise in changing the subject.
Yeah.
It's a distraction. And it was a distraction that was necessary in American post-war policy, because an honest account of what American was, and by post-war I mean after 1945, an honest account of what America was doing in the world would lead Americans to say, wait a minute, that's not what my country should be doing. And that was the problem that American leaders, not just one dipso senator from Wisconsin, but the whole group of them, that was the problem they had. They needed a massive exercise in distraction. And the distraction played upon the greatest tradition in American popular culture, fear. Fear of the Indians, fear of the slaves, fear of the foreigners, so forth and so on. Well, you had a whole new set of fears that you could get going after the Second World War, the fear of communism. Worldwide communism was suddenly going to seize your grandma. It was possible to do that in post-war America for a variety of reasons. But when we call it McCarthyism and take the part for the very small part for the very large whole, we're making an agreement with the propaganda mode of post-World War II American policy, and that propaganda mode was directed primarily at Americans, not foreigners. Foreigners knew perfectly well what America was doing in the world, but it was Americans who had to be who had to be handled. This was clear to our national leaders. You mentioned President Truman, who said, how is he going to get the war enthusiasm that led to the organization of the society in the early 1940s, how he's going to get that together now that the war was over. And he was told by a leading senator, you've got to scare hell out of the American people. Well, that's exactly what they did. The fright came from the Russians who were about to descend upon Western Europe, then cross the Atlantic and grab Connecticut. In fact, in 1945, the Russians were so exhausted by having won the Second World War that the Russian Army mechanized divisions in 1945 were horse-drawn. That was the army that was going to seize, America east of the Mississippi. The classic novel by Robert Heinlein about a Russian invasion of America from those years, repeated in various ways later, articulated this propaganda mode of America in the 50s. And it took a long time to dissolve that. As Noam Chomsky says, that's why people don't study history. It just teaches you too much. To come down to today, let me ask a question about recent events in regard to this background that you've sketched, David. What do you make of President Obama saying in an interview this week that the U.S. won't defend Israel at the United Nations the way we always have? Bravado, simply score, Barack Obama follows the tradition of John Kennedy, who said, in terms of international relations, don't get mad, get even. And he's certainly been working on getting even with Benjamin Netanyahu. And is this just sort of bravado directed at Netanyahu?
Yeah, I hadn't even heard about that. I'm not sure how I missed that, but I guess I guess I missed it, and I don't really have a ready-made comment on that. That would be.
I think it's worth missing. Yeah.
All I would say is maybe Obama's upset that David Blatt, the coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, is being supported by Benjamin Netanyahu, who says that all of Israel is behind the Cavs in their NBA Finals series.
That's the best explanation I've heard.
The best thing I could do is Obama's a secret Golden State Warriors fan, and he likes Steph Curry more than LeBron James, and that maybe Steve Kerr, Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, father was actually a well-known and very great Middle Eastern scholar, Malcolm Kerr, and maybe that enters into it. But no, I'm getting completely out of control here. So it's
a better explanation than New York Times had.
Yeah, I think Obama. It may have something to do with Iran and kind of preparing the ground for whatever is going to transpire. We haven't heard much about the nuclear deal lately. I guess it's sort of gone underground for a while, but there must be things going on, and it seems like Obama is also, he's speaking. He spoke. You can read an article on Mondo Weiss about a speech he made at a synagogue in Washington D.C. So he's doing a lot of things to, on the one hand, assure a Jewish community in this country that he's not going to do anything to really harm Israel, and we all know that. But there's, and then beyond that, I think I would refer you to Glenn Ford made some very scathing remarks about Obama's relationship to Israel and pandering to them in regards to referring to the civil rights movement in the context of. I don't even know what it was. It's just so ludicrous, the whole thing. But you can listen to what Glenn Ford had to say about that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask Carl. There was a discussion with Obama making the statement. I think it was in the same context that Israel risks losing credibility, and that sentence came up on his comments on Facebook. And I couldn't help but reply that I don't think Israel risks losing credibility. Israel has already lost credibility. I never got
With
so many
whom?
likes.
Yeah.
I never got so many likes worldwide on this particular person's website. So my take on that is that there are a lot of people out there who are very aware of what is taking place with Israel. So, yeah.
But it's not people who matter.
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
As
you're
Kofi
right.
Roberts
You're right.
puts it,
But,
yes.
but it
Yeah.
is worldwide. Yeah, this is a website that has attracted people, or should I say, a friend on my Facebook that
Well,
has
this, you know,
attracted worldwide audience.
This panicked attitude that the Israel lobby and beyond has about what's going on college campuses sort of indicates that there's been a shift on college campuses. There's been a
Right.
shift even in the broader population in this country.
Exactly.
The polling data shows that it isn't that people are pro-Palestine, but they're less pro-Israel, or they're just
Right.
neutral, and that's real progress
Yes.
for people to understand. People can't anymore believe that these bad Arabs are beating up on these
Right.
Israelis. People just can't believe that, but they don't have an alternative narrative to understand what the colonialist and imperialist context of all that really is. They can't go so far as to question what our support for Israel and their role in our strategic plans in that part of the world. The media doesn't give them that much, but it gives them enough to know that, you know, if I don't mean to compare Palestinians to children in any literal sense, but if you're walking down the street and you see a grown person beating up on a small child, you know that probably nothing that child could have done could merit what
Right.
that grown person is doing, you know.
And it's obvious who the
It just
bully
doesn't
is,
make any
right.
sense,
Right.
you know.
Right.
People don't know how to explain it, but they don't accept the conventional wisdom anymore. Again, which is why there is this fierce McCarthyite backlash and slanderous backlash against this.
And I think you're right to suggest that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, against the Israeli apartheid, is having an effect, at least enough of an effect to worry the Israeli leadership, the Netanyahu government. They have gone typically ballistic on the matter, and this has become an existential threat. So I always have a picture of Jean-Paul Sartre in the background, you know, condemning Israel, but that's not what they mean. An existential threat in the sense that a threat to Israel's existence. The BDS movement is a threat to Israel's existence, which is nonsense, of course.
Right.
But the notion that that the Israeli account can attack the BDS movement on those grounds and get a reasonable hearing from the American media is really hard to believe. It isn't a testimony to the fact that the movement is having some of the same effect on Americans' attitudes toward Israel, as you suggest, as a similar movement had on Americans' attitude towards apartheid South Africa. And that's not wrong. I mean, for all the differences between South Africa a generation ago and Israel now, the fact of the matter is that apartheid is a word that applies. Noam Chomsky says that, in fact, if you look at what actually happened in South Africa a generation ago and what's happening in Israel today, the situation of Palestinians in the occupied territories illegally occupied by Israel for more than 40 years, the situation of Palestinians there is worse than the situation of blacks under apartheid in the former South Africa. He says within Israel itself, the discrimination against Palestinians, against Arabs, really does exist, but it does not reach the level of the discrimination against blacks in South Africa. But the point is the occupied territories, their matters are worse indeed. And because of that very fact, there are direct economic effects coming out of the BDS movement towards Israel. There's a telecom called Orange that is a major European corporation, primarily French, I think, that has just said it's withdrawing its services from Israel. And this produced a typically hysterical reaction from the Israeli government. They said that's because they're a bunch of anti-Semites.
Right.
You know, what they're actually doing is going along with the understanding in Europe that the occupation of the occupied territories is illegal, and the exploitation of the occupied territories by Israel is also illegal. Now, there's a striking difference between what Israel is doing in the occupied territories and what South Africa did in the black homelands a generation ago. South Africa needed the labor of blacks, and it did not attack the black homelands, the Bantustans, the way Israel attacked Gaza last year. Israel doesn't need the labor of Palestinians and simply wants them to go away. Wants the land, wants the area, and wants to settle in it. So the situation is in fact very different, and as Chomsky explains, worse in the occupied territories occupied by Israel today than it was in South Africa at the time of South African apartheid. This distinction is lost on most American commentators, and the source of American support for the apartheid policies of Israel are also, I think, ignored, for whatever reason, by Americans. The U.S. finally is more interested in supporting its major ally in the Middle East so that it can control Middle East energy resources. That's been the purpose of American support for Israel since 1967. As David mentioned, it was the destruction of the leadership of secular Arab nationalism in Egypt in 1967 that first sort of attracted the attention of the United States to Israel, that set up the alliance of the United States and Israel. Israel had done an important job for the U.S. It had gotten a major roadblock out of the way in the Middle East, a major roadblock to America's control of the area's energy resources. That was Arab nationalism, the Arabs who said they wanted to use the resources of the region for the benefits of the people of the region. And the U.S. said, no, you can only do it if we permit it. But a serious roadblock to that American policy was removed by the war of choice that David described in 1967 with the defeat of Nasser's Egypt. By the way, the side note to that, which is something more than a side note, is that Arab nationalism, which had been secular up to that point, took a turn into forms of religious nationalism as sort of a safety valve after that, a story that would be worthwhile to relate if one took a rather longer view of the situation. But to see what America is doing, to see what American policy is, to see what the U.S. is doing in the region and in the world at large, that's the task. And that's, of course, the task that we're not supposed to do. The whole point of American propaganda is to make sure that American citizens don't quite understand what's going on. And there we are. You're watching News from Neptune, where we try to strike a blow against the empire every now and then.
We're a fearsome bunch. just look at us.
We're an existential threat to Israel, David.
Yes,
Come on.
I don't know. We've got the blue and the red, or the red and the black.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Well, at least we're not on that Canary website, as they call themselves.
Yeah.
Which I take offense at.
Yeah.
I'm of
I think
Irish.
anybody should. I think
Yeah.
anybody should.
Well,
take great offense at that.
Just the title, Canary.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, wait a minute, the Irish miners were known as the canaries that went into the mines.
Yeah.
And
the website is featured with pictures of the Holocaust, referring to the idea. Again, we should explain this and not assume people see. The notion has been propagated that Jews are that whenever there's genocide on tap, the Jews are the first ones. Jews are the canaries in the mine shaft, and so there's pictures of Holocaust of Jews in concentration camps and so forth, and that's not really a very good way of understanding history.
No, it's
without
not.
any disrespect, obviously, towards what happened at the Holocaust. In
Right.
fact, they're the ones disrespecting what happened
Yes, yes.
at the Holocaust, as Norman Finkelstein is always pointing out.
They're actually trivializing it
Yeah.
in that respect.
But yeah, I didn't mean you, Karen. You were going to start off with another.
No, I was just going to say that
Yeah.
I've always been referred to as the canary in the mine because of my allergies. You know, I walk into a room and I'll immediately say, "Oh no, sorry, the air is too bad" or whatever. My friends would laugh and they would say, "Oh, Karen's the canary in the mine." And of course, some of my ancestors were the Irish miners in the mines in Pennsylvania. But so when I saw that website, I thought it didn't quite resonate with me as to be even being a proper.
Yeah.
It's trivial. Let me ask Carl a question. You mentioned, Carl, that today is the anniversary of the Indonesian massacre. Were you referring to the one in 1965?
I was 65. Yes,
Okay.
I didn't mean today so much. I meant that we are at the 50th anniversary of the CIA organized massacre in Indonesia, which American planners at the time, we're talking 50 years ago, American planners at the time thought was the clear justification for the Vietnam War. But what American planners said, once it became clear that the CIA had organized a mass bloodletting in Indonesia, 100,000 people perhaps killed in the course of a couple of months. Once that became clear that the CIA had been so successful, in inverted commas, as to encourage this massacre of the Indonesian Communist Party and fellow travelers, what American planners said was, see, that's what the Vietnam War was really about. If we hadn't done the Vietnam War, we wouldn't have been in position to destroy Indonesian communism either. And Indonesia is very important to us as well. This was the inverse, if you like, of the so-called domino theory. But that was, most Americans, even through the 1960s, were not aware of what the U.S. was about in Indonesia, just as they weren't aware of what the U.S. was about in Indonesia much later, at the time of the East Timor independence. But for American planners, it was all of a part. It was an example of the sort of policy of maintaining economic hegemony in Southeast Asia, an economic hegemony that redounded to the profits of the American 1%, not many other people, and that was the real reason for the war in Vietnam, which was sold to Americans as stopping the communist menace. This worked perfectly. They could use the same lies to account for all those dead people in Indonesia, and at the same time accomplish that neo-imperialist policy that the U.S. was behind in the region. It's an important event, not just for the Indonesian people, so many of whom were killed by the U.S. As a result, but an important event in the propaganda structure that the U.S. was putting forward around the world.
Well, The Act of Killing is a film that was done a couple years ago. The gentleman who did the film's last name is Oppenheimer, along with another gentleman who remains, his name remains secret, for various reasons. And what they did was they actually were capable of getting the military people who had been involved in the massacre, and some of them who actually committed it, and had them do reenactments, and that was the film. It's interesting because while for some of these actors, killers, it may have been cathartic, according to Oppenheimer in his interviews with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, they actually found themselves almost trembling when they recognized the evil that they had done. I should point out that in Asia, reenactments of crimes tend to be the norm. When they catch someone before they go to trial, they have them do a reenactment, and it's publicized. And I rather suspect, from a foreign perspective, at first you're kind of taken aback that this is being shown to you before any trial takes place. But it's also probably because of Asian culture tends to be a shaming culture as opposed to a culture of guilt as we are. So it has that effect. But one of the things I want to point out is that And keep in mind, previous to the 1965 massacre in 1954, Eisenhower sent bombs, bombing the jungles because that's where the communists were in hiding. So, I mean, this was a continuation on the U.S. part. Oppenheimer's interview, he discussed the fact that he had interviewed two, one was a definite head of the CIA, the other was a U.S. Embassy employee affiliated with the CIA also. He actually lists the names of two, one, I think two are still alive, one is living in Virginia somewhere, and he actually listed their names on Amy's program, and you can actually go in and see that interview. What was disappointing to me, and I have not seen the film, I can't bring myself to watch it because I know I have to be in a certain frame of mind to take on, I watch a lot of war movies. Theater I can take, but when I know that it's real and true and really happened, it's hard. But it's online and it's free, evidently, at this point. But it does not come out in the film, because I've known people who have seen the film and they've mentioned that there's nowhere in the film where you see the CIA operative handing over a list of names of people to be targeted to the Indonesian military. So, and I've gotten this from a couple people, but it is mentioned in the interview between Amy Goodman and Mr. Oppenheimer. Now, and then we go on to the atrocities that were committed by the Indonesians in the 70s upon the people of East Timor. And of course, Australia was involved with Indonesia in some of that, just as Australia is now supporting the U.S. In the South China Sea in respect to what I call U.S. provocation against China.
This is an important, talk about an untold story.
Right.
I mean, this is vital.
What
the Obama administration is doing in the South China Sea right now, if it's mentioned at all in American news, we're looking at the perfidious Chinese and what they're up to.
That's
American
what we
policy
see,
is never the issue.
Right, and that's what we see. See, the CNN journalists were actually invited on board one of our airplanes. I can give you the type of plane it was, but you know, it's buried in my details here. Bottom line, they were invited aboard, just as our embedded journalists in Iraq and Syria have been.
Again, huh?
Yes, to go and watch how they provoke China into telling them to please remove themselves from that particular area, these islands, where China, as well as other Asian nations, they're all building these, building up these islands and building up reefs and artificial islands, as they call them. But they're building a military base on one of the islands in the Spratlys, which, given the fact that the U.S. is building a military base on the island of Jeju off the coast of South Korea, which is being opposed.
Yes.
I'm waiting for Kathy Kelly to write her article on that, so we can talk more about it.
She's working on that.
She's working on that now. Has she been released from prison yet for daring?
Yeah, she's out.
She is
she's
out now.
out
Good. Okay.
This time.
Okay, and that should be mentioned. She served, 3 months in prison
Right.
for offering bread to people on a military base. Anyway, I mean, these are the kinds of things that we incarcerate
Demonstration
people
against the
for.
drone, against the secret drone war.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, as a peace protester, yes, exactly. So, but we are provoked. And this morning's headlines, of course, is that I don't know how over 1 million federal employees have had all of their data cyber attacked. And all of their data is now in the hands of these cyber attackers. And
Who do they think they are? The NSA? Come on.
China. It's all China. And on CNN, they even refer to the China state, the China government.
Right.
And I'm thinking, geez, if this doesn't sound just like Putin was responsible for the downing of the MH370 airline,
Right.
or the disappearance, I get the two mixed up. The one that disappeared, the Malaysian airline that disappeared, and the Dutch airline that was down. You know, within a day, CNN and the news media is immediately targeting Putin and Russia. Well, now, within a day of announcing this hacking, we are immediately, it's China, without a doubt. I'm not saying that it isn't. I don't know. But until we have evidence, but I've been waiting for this. I mean, I actually was waiting for this, not expecting it would arrive within a day of, or within a week of all that's taking place in the South China Sea. And I think the most important thing to note about what is taking place in the South China Sea, if there is a dispute between Asian nations in Asia over specific islands in the South China Sea, they will solve the problem amongst them. They all do business. There is so much business being conducted between China and Vietnam and China and Korea. All of these nations, even China and Japan, have such strong business ties, in spite of the fact that the U.S. has remilitarized Japan. And I think anybody out there who knows that one of the things we did, which even many of my Japanese professors in Japan said was a very good thing that we did regarding Japan. The only one thing we did was not hanging the emperor. I mean, that would have been abominable. But demilitarizing Japan, because they had such a cult of militarization, if you understand their culture. And remilitarization is something we should always, always avoid. Of course, that's partly why they were successful putting money into business.
That's the Obama administration's policy, though.
Well, it's not just the Obama I'm sorry, it isn't just Obama. It really goes back to Kissinger and Brzezinski.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, these are the advisors, and even Pepe Escobar, one of our favorite journalists, has mentioned the fact that what is taking place in the South China Sea, in spite of U.S. provocations, is that the Asian nations will likely solve their own problems. It will be ASEAN and China. But in the meantime, let's just hope that we don't end up provoking a major nation into nuclear war, which is what it appears we're doing.
A real account of American policy towards both Russia and China that put it in context.
Right.
We'll see that as a real danger.
Exactly.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 23rd week of 2015, a Don't Talk About the War edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Karen Aram and David Green. Our thanks to our director and producer, Dan Penno. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in the CU. See our Facebook page for News from Neptune, and the blog newsfromneptune.com is back up after a long absence. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.